Mr. President, I rise with my good friend from Tennessee to discuss some truly landmark legislation we'll be introducing later today. This is long overdue. It's called the Music Modernization Act, and it will reshape the music licensing landscape to bring it into the 21st century. As a songwriter myself, I have a deep interest in music issues and in ensuring we have a music licensing system that works. Unfortunately, our music licensing laws have not kept pace with the technological change. We have an outdated, antiquated system designed for the era of CD and cassette tape rather than the era of digital streamlining and audio on demand. Most of us rarely think about the complex laws that govern who can listen to what music, when, and who gets paid when we purchase an MP3 or listen to an interactive stream. We pay our money to iTunes or the streaming service without thinking about how that money gets distributed to dozens, even hundreds of actors across the music industry. You have songwriters and publishers and recording artists and record labels. You have agents and broadcasters and streaming services and performing rights organizations. You have multiple copyrights across multiple individuals for the same song. It's a dense, interconnected web of licenses, rights, and legal obligations that all need and should be carefully calibrated. And our current regime is not well calibrated. Far from it. To begin with, the process of ensuring that songwriters are paid when a song they write is downloaded or played on the internet is a complete mess. The problem lies in matching sound recordings to the underlying musical work, that is, to the song performed in the sound recording. When a person downloads or streams a song, there are actually two sets of copyright holders whose interests come into play. First is the recording artist, who owns a copyright in the sound recording, that is, in the recorded version of the song. Often the recording artist will have assigned his or her copyright to a record label. The other relevant copyright holder is the songwriter, the person who actually wrote the music, and in virtually every case, the lyrics that the recording artist performed. The songwriter owns a copyright in the song itself, in the actual words and music. Often the songwriter will have assigned his or her copyright to a music publisher. When a sound recording is reproduced, whether by download, interactive stream, or fixing the song on a CD or other physical object, the recording artist and songwriter or their respective assignees both receive a royalty. The recording artist receives a royalty for the sound recording itself, and the songwriter receives a royalty for the underlying song. These are called mechanical royalties because historically, reproduction of sound recordings was done through mechanical means. Think of a vinyl record and its grooves. There's also a second type of royalty that comes into play when a song is performed publicly, such as on the radio at a concert or over a digital transmission service like Pandora. This type of royalty is called, sensibly enough, a public performance royalty, and just like the mechanical royalties, it is paid to both the recording artist and the songwriter or their assignees. As I said earlier, the problem lies in matching the sound recording to the underlying musical work. That is, in determining who should get paid when an individual downloads a song or listens to an interactive stream. Figuring out the recording artist is pretty easy. When digital music services play music, they play sound recordings. They play a song recorded by Taylor Swift or Jay-Z or Garth Brooks, or they offer the sound recording for download. In either case, determining who recorded the song is straightforward. Figuring out who the songwriter is, however, can be much more complicated. A recording artist may play 10 different songs by 10 different songwriters on a single album, or 10 separate writers may have contributed to a single song, with each entitled to a cut. And unlike with recording artists, it's usually not apparent from the sound recording itself who the songwriter is. Of course, the recording artist or the record label, if the recording artist has assigned his or her rights to a record label, may know who the songwriter is, but not always, and it's simply not feasible for digital music providers to independently track down every individual songwriter for the millions of songs they offer over their services. The problem of unmatched works, that is, works for whom the sound recording has not been matched to the underlying songwriter, creates significant difficulties for both digital music providers and songwriters. Start with digital music providers. By law, these services are required to pay mechanical royalties to songwriters for interactive streams and digital downloads. But if they don't know who the relevant songwriter or publisher is, they can't pay the royalty. This exposes digital music providers to significant liability if the songwriter or publisher later appears and asserts its rights. At the same time, songwriters get short shrift because they don't get paid when they're supposed to be. Streaming services play their songs, and digital platforms offer their songs for download without paying the required royalties. As you can see, this is a complicated system. It's a bad situation all around. That's where the legislation Senator Alexander and I are introducing today comes into play. Our bill, the Music Modernization Act, creates a blanket mechanical license for digital music providers. This license, which will be administered by a mechanical licensing collective, will enable digital music providers to obtain a single mechanical license for the music they play, rather than having to individually seek out songwriters and publishers. Services that obtain the license will receive liability protection. Songwriters and publishers, in turn, will benefit from increased royalty statements. Among the mechanical licensing collective's duties will be establishing and maintaining a public database that identifies musical works and their owners. Now, this will help reduce the number of unmatched works. In addition, the Music Modernization Act provides that royalties for unmatched works will be distributed after a holding period of 3 years to known copyright holders on a market share basis. This means that rather than going unpaid, royalties for unmatched works will go to existing copyright holders, or according to how active each copyright holder is in the marketplace. Our bill also contains a critical update to the rate standard for mechanical royalties for songwriters. Current law requires the Copyright Royalty Board to consider a variety of statutory factors in setting mechanical royalties. These factors, however, do not accurately reflect market demand, with the result that songwriters are paid a below-market rate. Our bill revises this standard to instruct the board to establish rates that reflect what a willing buyer and a willing seller would agree to in the marketplace. Lastly, the bill makes 2 changes related to public performance royalties for songwriters. As I explained earlier, this type of royalty comes into play when a song is performed publicly, such as on the radio, at a concert, or over a digital transmission service like Pandora. Public performance royalties for songwriters are publishers are administered through performing rights organizations, or PROs, the most well-known of which are ASCAP and BMI. ASCAP and BMI offer blanket licenses to radio stations, restaurants, digital transmission services, and others that allow licenses to play all songs in the PRO's catalog. These blanket licenses are governed by 2 1940s-era consent decrees that require all rates under the licenses to be set or approved by a federal judge in the Southern District of New York. The Music Modernization Act makes two changes relevant to these consent decrees. First, it says that any judge in the Southern District of New York may hear a rate-setting case involving ASCAPs or BMI's license fees, not just the particular judge who oversees the consent decree. Second, the bill revises current law to allow judges in these rate-setting proceedings to consider evidence of public performance royalties paid for sound recordings in setting public performance royalties for songwriters. The purpose of this provision is to better align public performance royalties for sound recordings with public performance royalties for the underlying musical work, and to ensure that songwriters are properly rewarded when a song they write becomes a hit. Mr. President, as I mentioned earlier, music licensing is an incredibly complicated subject. I've endeavored today to explain the Music Modernization Act in a straightforward way that individuals not steeped in this subject can understand. The key points are as follows. First, the bill will help solve the problem of unmatched works so that digital music providers are protected from liability and songwriters receive the royalties they're due. Second, the bill will better align royalties for songwriters with royalties for recording artists and with market demand. It will also bring much needed transparency to our music licensing system by creating a public database that identifies musical works and their owners. I'm pleased to report that our bill has broad support across the music industry, which is a tremendous thing. One of the things that makes this legislation such a breakthrough is that we've been able to get the songwriting side of the industry, the songwriters and their representatives in all these matters, in the publishing and PRO community, on board with the recording and distribution side of the industry, the record labels and digital music providers. Indeed, Mr. President, I don't think I've ever seen a music bill that has such broad support across the industry. All sides have a stake in this, and they've come together in support of a common-sense consensus bill that addresses challenges throughout the music industry. Introduction is just the start of the process. Bill's chances as they move through markup and floor consideration, and there are some outstanding issues in the latter part of the bill that remain to be resolved with broadcasters. I'm committed to working through these issues as the bill moves forward so that we have the broadcast or the broadest consensus possible. I said at the outset, Mr. President, that I'm a songwriter myself. I have a deep and abiding interest in these issues. These matters are personal to me. They're also an important part of my legacy. But I'm relatively unknown, and I don't expect to make a lot of money out of the music industry. But I am deeply interested in this and making sure that those who do create these wonderful musical subjects really are treated more fairly than they are today. I fought long and hard for strong copyright protections my entire time in the Senate. I passed a number of landmark copyright bills, from the Copyright Term Extension Act to the Digital Millennium Copyright Act to the Family Movie Act. The Music Modernization Act is another in that long line of landmark legislation. In fact, Mr. President, I view it as the capstone of my work on copyright. I say that, Mr. President, because I want my colleagues to know how important this bill is, not just to me, but to my friends. And I want my friends in the industry to know how important this bill is to me as well. I have less than a year left in this body, and one thing that I'm dead set on is enacting this bill into law before I leave. I hope my colleagues will join me in supporting and sponsoring this bill. The music we create in our country is an important part of our culture and of the message we carry to the rest of the world. Let's do everything we can to ensure we have a music licensing system that's fair. That rewards creativity, and that creates the right incentives to write, perform, and sell music. That's exactly what the Music Modernization Act will do. I have a partner in this business of trying to get this bill through, and that's the great senator from the state of Tennessee, Lamar Alexander, who himself is a very accomplished musician. He's a great piano player, and he's a great friend, and he understands these issues as much, if not more, than anybody else I know in the Congress of the United States. And I just feel very indebted to him and blessed to have him as one of the people who will be working with me on this matter. With that, I yield the floor.
Mr. President. Mr. President, I want to thank the senator from Utah for his leadership. He is not only the senior Republican senator and the former chairman of the Judiciary Committee, which will hear this legislation, and chairman of the Finance Committee, he's a songwriter himself. And not just a songwriter, he has a platinum record, and he has a gold record, and he has another one that might become gold. So he knows what he's talking about. And I think for all of us in the Senate, that when Orrin Hatch says that in his 40 years or so here, or his years here, more than any other Republican senator, that this is the capstone of his career and his work on copyright, and it's personally important to him. I think that means something to the rest of us here. I think that means that among all of the other issues here, that we're going to pay more attention to this, and we're going to work hard to pass it. And I hope it means something to those outside this chamber, the songwriters themselves, the digital music companies, the music publishers, the broadcasters. This is something we intend to do. We intend to make this a law because it is right to do it, because the songwriters aren't being treated fairly, and because it's important to Senator Hatch, whom we respect. And when Senator Hatch stands up on the floor and says, I've been working since 1977 on copyright issues, and we know how many important issues he's dealt with, and he says this is the capstone of all those issues, we should pay attention to that, and we should deal with it. And I think we will be able to deal with it because we start off with very strong bipartisan support. This afternoon, Senator Hatch and I will file the Music Modernization Act here. We'll begin with 8 members of the Senate, including Senator Hatch, of course, as the lead sponsor. I'll be there. But in addition to that, Senator Whitehouse, the senator from Rhode Island, a Democrat, Senator Corker, senator from Tennessee, Senator Dick Durbin, the senator from Illinois. Dick Durbin is in Nashville nearly as much as Orrin Hatch is in Nashville. Dick Durbin is not a songwriter, but he loves country music, and he loves songwriting, he loves music, and he's the #2 Democrat in the Senate, the Democratic whip. So to begin to have that sort of co-sponsorship, in addition to Senator Isaacson, Senator Coons of Delaware, our newest senator, Senator Jones of Alabama. Those are the 8 of us in the Senate who are starting this bill, and we hope others on both sides of the aisle will see the wisdom of it. Mr. President, Italy has its art, Egypt has its pyramids, Napa Valley has its wine, and Nashville has its songwriters. Songwriters are the lifeblood of Music City. The mayor of Nashville was in my office today. We talked about that. We have thousands of songwriters in Nashville. We have a lot in Memphis, too. We have many in Bristol and Knoxville and East Tennessee, where the music really started, the country music. But in Nashville, we have thousands of songwriters. They are waiters. They are bus drivers. They are teachers. They are having other jobs as they build their songwriting careers. Their paychecks ought to be based on a fair market value of the work they create. Songwriters are paid when their songs are played. They get a royalty. And we want to make sure that their hits that are heard around the world are felt in their pocketbooks. The arrival of the internet has transformed the music industry, but it's also meant that many songwriters simply aren't paid their royalties when their songs are played online. This is the first problem, the arrival of the internet. The second problem is that when the songwriters aren't paid, they're not paid a fair market value for their work. Senator Hatch, as I've mentioned, has long been an advocate for musicians. He understands this. We've worked together for over a year with Representative Doug Collins in the House of Representatives on the Music Modernization Act, which 8 of us will introduce this afternoon. It's bipartisan, as I said. It represents the first major consensus legislation that has the support of songwriters, of music publishers, of digital music companies, and of record labels. And Senator Hatch and I are going to continue to work together to make sure it has the support of broadcasters as well. More importantly, the legislation will have a real impact on songwriters in Tennessee and elsewhere. First, it creates a simple licensing system for direct music services like Pandora, Amazon, etc., to reflect a changing music industry. And second, it'll make it easier for the songwriters to be paid when their music is played or someone buys a song that they wrote. And third, it will allow them to be paid for the fair market value of their work. That's what the bill does. Now, to give you an idea of what this really means, let me tell you a story about songwriting. I do not have the experience that the senator from Utah has. He's written more than 100 songs over the years, co-written with a number of Nashville songwriters, as a matter of fact, some of them. And he's even has a song that's a platinum record. But a few years ago, I was in East Tennessee in my hometown of Maryville, and I walked out of the pharmacy and I saw an older couple sitting in a pickup truck, and I asked them how they were doing, and the woman said, of she and her husband, she said, "We're just falling apart together." Well, that weekend, my son Drew was having a songwriters retreat at our home in East Tennessee. He's in the music business. And so I told one of them, Lee Bryce, about that, what the woman said to me, falling apart together. Lee Bryce said, "I think I can do something with that." So he and Billy Montana and John Stone, the songwriters, wrote a song called Falling Apart Together. Lee Bryce put that on one of his albums, and I got 1/4 of the song rights. That's the way it works in Nashville. If you contribute anything, including just the song name to a song, you get a part of the royalty. Well, Lee Bryce is a pretty well-known singer as well as a songwriter, and he put the song on his album, and you would think the royalty would add up to a lot of money. But in 2016, on my Senate financial disclosure, I reported receiving $101.75 in royalties for my 1/4 of the song Falling Apart Together. If you're a songwriter living in Nashville or Memphis or Los Angeles or New York or anywhere, or Provo or Salt Lake City, you can't make a living on $101.75. The other problem facing songwriters is that music is increasingly played online. Companies like Spotify, Pandora, Amazon, Apple offer listeners virtually unlimited access to digital music libraries that they can play using the internet whenever they want. According to Nielsen, there are nearly 86 million paying subscribers to these types of digital music streaming services. 86 million paying subscribers. In 2016, these subscribers listened to more than 252 billion music streams, including repeated songs. So in 2016, for the first time in history, streaming music services, songs played online, generated more than half the music industry's revenues. Digital music services such as Spotify, Pandora, and Apple Music generated the majority, or 51.4% of the music industry's revenues. So we know that the internet has changed our world. It's changed politics. It's changed newspapers. It's changed retail. We've seen the effect of it. It's changed the music industry too. 1/2 of the music industry's revenues come from online songs that are played. And as Senator Hatch has said, our laws have not kept up with that. And as a result, our songwriters, the creators, who have a right under our Constitution to be paid for their work, a fair market value, aren't being paid in many cases. And when they are paid, they're not being paid a fair market value. Sales of compact discs fell below $100 million in 2016, a 17% decline from 2015. This means that it's getting much more difficult for songwriters to make a living, and Congress can't change the fact that the internet and other new technologies have changed the music industry, but we do have a responsibility to update our laws to keep up with what has happened. So how did we get in this mess, and what laws are we talking about updating? In 1909, Mr. President, more than a century ago, Congress gave copyright owners of musical works the exclusive right to make, reproduce, and distribute their own musical work. At the time, the works were primarily piano rolls. So we're talking about laws that were created for player pianos. Congress set the royalty to be paid to the owners of those piano rolls at 2 cents per copy. The Copyright Royalty Board, a 3-judge panel at the Library of Congress, still sets those royalty rates today. The current rate's 9.1 cents. It's based on below market standard. Another problem is that ASCAP and BMI, Senator Hatch mentioned this, the 2 largest performance rights organizations, are subject to a 76-year-old consent decree with the Department of Justice. That means an agreement agreed upon in 1940 or so, and ever since then it's been governing these performance rights rates. These consent decrees never contemplated the internet, and today they are harming Nashville songwriters. The biggest problem with these outdated consent decrees is that songwriters don't get paid the fair market value for their work. Songwriters negotiate with radio stations for the right to play their music in exchange for a, quote, reasonable performance royalty. If songwriters and the radio stations can't agree on the reasonable royalty, the songwriters have to go to a federal rate court, which means their case is heard by district judges in New York, in the Southern District of New York. Under current law, the judge is not allowed to consider what the song's performer earns when he sets a reasonable royalty. The Music Modernization Act changes that by allowing ASCAP and BMI to present new evidence about the fair market value of the songwriter's work, like what a performer might earn, to a federal rate court judge when there's a dispute about royalty rates. The legislation also allows more federal district judges to hear these type of cases. The music industry has changed dramatically in the past 109 years. It's time to update our music licensing laws to ensure songwriters can continue to make a living. Now, what the Music Industry Act does to solve the problem is this. It creates a new simplified licensing entity to make it easier for the digital music companies, this is Spotify, Pandora, to obtain a license to play songs and ensure songwriters are paid when their music is played. Instead of Spotify and Pandora tracking down each songwriter or a songwriter's publisher to get permission to play a song, they'll be able to submit one license and start playing a song right away. Transitioning to a blanket license for reproductions was recommended by the Copyright Office of the Library of Congress. In a February 2015 report on music licensing reforms, the Copyright Office recommended this blanket licensing approach that's included in the Music Modernization Act. The Copyright Office report concluded that song-by-song licensing is widely perceived as a daunting requirement for new services and as an administrative drag on the licensing system as a whole. The move to a blanket system would allow marketplace entrants to launch their services and begin paying royalties more quickly. Another important point is the new licensing entity won't be a new government agency, and the digital music companies will pay to set it up and keep it running, not songwriters. The new entity will be governed by songwriters and music publishers, giving songwriters a say in how their work is used for the first time. And the new entity helps songwriters because it will collect royalties each time a song is played, look for the songwriter, and hold on to the royalties for 3 years until they can be found. This helps songwriters because it ensures they are paid royalties for their work, whether they have a publisher or not. This helps digital music companies because it makes sure songwriters are paid, and that means fewer lawsuits. The legislation also improves transparency by creating a publicly accessible database for all music works and requires digital music companies to pay songwriters their royalties every month. Songwriters will receive usage reports on music that's played to make sure the money is all there. The new database is important because maybe a young, inspiring songwriter co-wrote a song under an alias or moved or simply can't be located. The legislation allows songwriters to audit the licensing entity once a year if the songwriter chooses. And finally, the legislation requires the Copyright Royalty Board at the Library of Congress to use a fair market standard of what a willing buyer would pay a willing seller when the board sets royalty rates. This helps songwriters receive a fair market royalty when their song is played online. The Music Modernization Act, as Senator Hatch said, has broad support, really unprecedented support. It's a consensus piece of legislation. It's supported by the National Music Publishers Association, the Digital Media Association, the American Society for Composers, Authors, and Publishers, that's ASCAP, the Broadcast Music Incorporated, that's BMI, Nashville Songwriters Association International, the Songwriters of North America, and on January 8th, these groups joined the Recording Industry Association of America, the Recording Academy, and more than a dozen music industry groups in endorsing the Music Modernization Act. It will help thousands of songwriters in Nashville, across Tennessee, and across this country. Songwriters, music publishers, and digital music companies have reached a consensus. Now it's up to Congress to provide a result. That's why I'm working in such a bipartisan way, and so glad to be working with our such eminent leaders as Senator Hatch, Senator Durbin, and others to pass the Music Modernization Act and give Tennessee and our nation songwriters the fair pay that they've earned. I want to thank Senator Hatch's staff, as well as my own staff, once again, because they've been working on this issue for some time. And the Senator Hatch, was the original co-sponsor of legislation in the 114th Congress titled the Songwriter Equity Act. I'm proud to work with him. I want to thank Representative Doug Collins and Representative Hakeem Jeffries, who are the sponsors of the bill in the House of Representatives. They're leading the effort to get the bill through the House Judiciary Committee so it can be considered by the full House. Finally, I'd like to thank Bart Herbison with the Nashville Songwriters Association, David Israelite with the National Music Publishers Association, Beth Matthews with ASCAP, Mike O'Neill with BMI, Greg Barnes and Chris Harrison with the Digital Media Association. These individuals have all worked together and negotiated for months to try to produce a consensus legislation to help songwriters and modernize the music licensing laws. So, Mr. President, let me end where I began. This is a bill to help songwriters. This is a bill to modernize a copyright system. This is a bill to help our laws keep up with the digital age, the internet world. This is a bill that has consensus among digital companies and songwriters and publishers for the first time. And this is a bill to honor Orrin Hatch, who has served in this body since 1977, who's a songwriter himself, who has been our leader on modernizing copyright laws from the very beginning. And I intend to work as hard as I can in a bipartisan way, both in the Senate and the House, to pass this bill for the good of our country and as a capstone of the career of our senior United States Senator, Senator Hatch. I thank the President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
President Pro Tem.
I can't express my appreciation well enough to thank the senator from Tennessee for this wonderful set of remarks that he's just given. He's outlined it as well as it could be done. I can see why Tennessee's always been very well represented, but Lamar Alexander is one of the great senators here, and I'm just grateful that he is standing side by side with me on this, because the songwriters of America have been mistreated for years and years and years, and it's time to change it. It's time to get some equity and some fairness into this system. And I think Lamar has outlined that about as well as it can be outlined. And I just want to personally express my appreciation to you and for what you've said here today.